Late October rain at the foot of the Sawatch Range is not the rain people picture when they hear the word Colorado. At 2,000 meters of elevation, rain doesn't fall, it attacks. The wind off the snow-capped peaks dropped into the Arkansas Valley, carrying a dry cold so sharp that the air tasted faintly of metal on the tongue. And water hammered the kitchen window of Brooks Meadow Ranch with the crisp sound of crushed gravel. Levi Brooks was stirring the last of Monday's beef chili. He had reheated it 3 times that week. A man living alone at Brooks Meadow Ranch for 7 years, he had grown used to cooking once for 3 days. Beside the pot sat a square of cornbread baked that morning, already drying at the edges. On the cast-iron radiator against the wall, his leatherwork gloves lay upside down, faint steam rising from them in thin threads. He had just come in from the calf shed. A 10-week-old heifer had stood apart from the herd all afternoon, her head hanging low. He suspected pneumonia. The latest batch from Wyoming had been driven up to elevation too fast. He had been out there nearly 2 hours. His sheepskin-lined denim jacket still draped over the chair in the laundry room, dripping a long, dark trail across the floorboards. Then someone pounded on the door. Not knocking, pounding, frantic, repeating, the kind of pounding that in Salida only ever meant one thing. Someone was standing at the threshold of something they could not walk back from. Levi set down the spoon and walked to the front room. When he opened the door, the hallway light fell across Abigail Stone's face, and for the first moment, he didn't recognize her. Her hair was plastered to her forehead. She wasn't wearing a coat warm enough for the weather, only a thick gray wool sweater under a thin dark cardigan, already soaked through. Both hands clutched a slim, black leather portfolio with a brass clasp. The kind of portfolio Matthew Stone used to carry to meetings at the bank. She didn't say his name right away. She just stood there, lips parting once, then swallowing hard. It took her until the second try to make a sound, and it wasn't his name. It was a dry, abbreviated sentence. "I'm sorry for the hour." Levi looked down at her shoes. That was the first thing he noticed. Mud caked up to her ankles, not the gray clay from his own yard. This was red clay, the kind that ran only along a stretch of the Silver Creek Trail between the 2 ranches. She had walked at least 4 miles in the rain. "Where's your truck?" She didn't answer at first. She glanced quickly toward the main road, a fast look, almost reflexive, as though she were checking for someone behind her. Then she said, "I didn't want to leave it at Stone River tonight." That sentence woke him faster than any cup of coffee could have. He pulled her inside and shut the door. She stood in the middle of his small front room, trembling hard enough that the brass clasp on the portfolio made a small, helpless rattling sound. He took a clean towel from the laundry basket and handed it to her. "What's happened?" She pressed the towel to her hair, but did not sit down. Abigail Stone had always been that kind of woman. Levi had seen her from across the fence line of her father's ranch many times over 6 years. Weekends were cashmere sweaters and books in her hands. Monday mornings were old jeans and one of her father's flannel shirts. 24 years old, finance degree from CU Boulder, quietly pretty, and somehow always, with the look of someone who hadn't yet decided where she belonged. He knew her, but the person he had really known was Matthew Stone, her father. There is something people rarely articulate about being a neighbor in ranch country. They think a neighbor is the person who lives next door, shares a fence line, shares a road, occasionally shares a tractor when yours breaks. But I think that definition misses the heart of it. A real neighbor is the person who knows when you are breaking without being told. Matthew Stone had been that kind of neighbor to Levi Brooks for 7 years, ever since Levi's parents died in a wreck on I-70 the winter Levi was 19. Matthew didn't say much. He just showed up. There are fathers we are born with, and there are fathers life pushes onto our doorstep at the moments we believed we couldn't keep going. The second kind is rarer and more precious, because they chose us when nothing obligated them to choose. Matthew had died 3 months earlier. Pancreatic cancer, caught late, gone fast. "It's the will," Abigail said. He nodded toward the kitchen. "Sit down first." "I can stand." Abigail. That did it. She walked in and sat at the table. He set a half-finished mug of coffee back on the radiator to warm up. He didn't know what to do with his hands. She opened the leather portfolio. Inside, neatly arranged, an original will stamped by Chaffee County Records, a certified copy, and a letter from attorney William Hartley. "My father added a clause," she said. "I didn't know. Nobody told me until today." "What clause?" She swallowed and looked at her own fingers. "If I'm not married by the deadline, I don't get full operational control of Stone River. Garrett does." Levi stood still. The coffee on the radiator was warming again, the faint smell of overheated grounds rising up. "When's the deadline?"
This Friday.
"This Friday." It was Monday night. He lifted the mug off the radiator and set it on the table. He didn't pour any for her. He couldn't remember whether she drank coffee black, and this didn't feel like the moment to ask. "And Garrett?" "He drove up from Denver this morning. New Range Rover, Italian shoes, sat down in William's office and asked when he could list the land. A real estate firm on the Front Range. They want to subdivide it into a resort plot for Texans." That put something hard into Levi's chest. He had met that kind of man before. The kind who looked at a pasture and saw lot lines. The kind who looked at a barn and saw scrap lumber. They always said the same things. Be practical, take the money, move on. As if land were only land and not 60 years of sweat hammered into every post. She slid a piece of paper toward him. It was smaller than the other documents, handwritten, in Matthew's hand. "He didn't put your name in the will. He put it in a separate note attached to it. He said if anything happened, you'd be the one neighbor who'd understand." Levi didn't touch the paper. He looked at her. "What are you asking me?" That was when she really looked at him. Her eyes were red, but she didn't blink. "I'm asking you to marry me." The kitchen went so quiet, Levi could hear the cast iron radiator contracting in the cold. He leaned back. "Abigail, I know how it sounds. I don't think you do." "I do," she said quickly. "I know it's strange. I know it's unfair to you, but I don't have anyone else. Garrett has already told half of Salida that I'm too soft to run the ranch. The hired hands don't know who to listen to. William Hartley keeps repeating the deadline, as if I can push it back by worrying harder." Levi rubbed his face with both hands. He was tired in a way that was hard to name. Not tired from work, but tired from having a woman sit at his kitchen table and ask him a question that neither of them had any right to ask. "Are you using me?" Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since coming into the house, she was completely still. "Yes," she said softly, "but not the way that sounds. I'm asking to be helped. I'm not going to lie to you about what it is." He looked around the kitchen. Above the sink, the pine paneling had an old crack, a strip his father had patched with black electrical tape in 2009 and forgotten to replace. His mother had carved 3 names into the wood beside it: Daniel, Ruth, Levi, 2002, with a paring knife the year he turned 12. The 2 on top were gone. He had no one to talk to about tonight, no one to ask. He thought about what it felt like to have people waiting for him to fail. He had lived inside that feeling for 7 years. "If I say yes," he said, "there's one rule." Abigail sat up straight. "No lies between us. Not in this house, not at this table. On the outside, we do what has to be done, but between you and me, we stay clean. You don't pretend this is love, and I don't pretend I'm any kind of hero. The two of us know what it is." She nodded, quickly first, then slower, as if wanting him to know she had heard it for real. "And if this turns ugly, you don't hide things from me." "I won't." He looked at her, wet hair, leather portfolio, the way she tried not to look scared. "We'll go to the courthouse in the morning." Levi didn't sleep. He lay there counting the rain as it softened to dripping, then to wind. He thought about Matthew Stone, about his own mother, who had asked him at 18 who he was going to marry. He thought about Sarah Ellis, the girl he had been engaged to at 24, the girl who had returned the ring on a March morning with one sentence: "I can't live until I'm 70 with the smell of hay on my clothes, Levi." I think people misunderstand the promises they make to themselves. They believe those promises are commitments, and every violation is a betrayal. But I don't believe that. I believe the promises we make to ourselves are a kind of map, a map of the self at the moment of promising. When we change, the old map no longer fits. The problem is not the broken promise. The problem is failing to notice that the territory has become a different country. Levi had promised himself, after the day Sarah left, that he would never marry a woman he didn't love. That Tuesday morning, he was about to break the promise. But I don't believe he was betraying the old version of himself. I believe he was becoming a version that the old version hadn't lived long enough to understand. They drove into town around 8:30 in the morning. The sky had cleared. Frost lay white across the pastures along Highway 50 like salt scattered over a green rug, and Mount Shavano stood out against the sky with its first snowcap of the season. In the cab of his 2003 Chevy pickup, the heater blew too hot. Neither of them said a word. Abigail wore an ivory cardigan that came down to her knees, with a soft flannel shirt underneath. The cardigan was clearly her mother's, slightly oversized at the shoulder. She had put on light makeup. She had tied her hair back with a thin leather thong. There was something both poignant and broken about how she had tried to make the morning look like a normal wedding, and failed. Levi wore the cleanest shirt he owned. Near the waistline of the placket was a small, round burn. A cigar ash had landed there at Matthew Stone's funeral 3 months earlier, when Levi had stood alone at the back of the gathering, smoking the cigar Matthew himself had given him in 2018, and that Levi had kept unsmoked until that morning. He didn't repair the burn. The burn had become a kind of marker. Chaffee County Courthouse was the red brick building from 1882 at the corner of F Street and Crestone Avenue. On the way in, they passed a coffee shop spilling bluegrass music, an old woman walking a small dog across the street, and a town worker sweeping dry leaves out of the gutter. The life of the town continued around them as though nothing in particular was happening. The clerk at the records office was Marion Helmer, a grey-haired woman around 60 who had worked there since before Levi was born. She looked from Abigail to Levi and back again, curious but polite. She did not ask. They filled out the paperwork. Levi read every line. The first time in his life he had read paperwork carefully without it being a bank loan. He wrote his parents' names in the parental information field, Daniel Brooks and Ruth Brooks, and realized only then that this was the first time he had written those two names side by side since the funeral. The pen paused for half a second. When it came time to sign, Abigail's hand trembled, her signature smudged at the S of Stone. She stared at it, alarmed, and asked Marion if she needed to sign again. Marion smiled. "Sweetheart, no human signature is perfect. The law doesn't care about the handwriting. The law only cares that the signature is yours." Abigail bowed her head, and Levi saw a single tear fall onto the walnut surface of the desk. Just one. She wiped it away quickly. The judge was a tired old man named Mortimer Hayes. He read the vows in a flat voice. When it came time for "I do," Levi's voice went hoarse. It was the first time in his life he had said those words to a woman. He hadn't expected them to weigh as much as they did, even when everything around them was light. They had no rings. They hadn't thought of it in time. When it was done, they stood in the hallway for a moment, holding the official paper. "Now we keep your ranch standing," Levi said. She nodded, but her eyes were not on the paper. Her eyes were on him. That was the first moment Levi understood this was not going to stay as simple as he had hoped. That afternoon, Abigail moved into Brooks Meadow with 2 bags of clothes, 1 raincoat, and a cardboard box of papers she didn't trust Garrett with at Stone River. Levi led her to the guest room at the end of the hall. There was a pieced quilt his mother had stitched in the winter of 1996, a diamond pattern in brown and gold in the Ohio style of her childhood. The top drawer of the dresser stuck if you pulled it too hard. The window faced the west pasture and the snow on the collegiate peaks. Abigail stood in the doorway, still holding both bags. "Bathroom's across the hall," he said. "Closet door sticks if you yank it. I'll oil it later." "Thank you." "You don't need to thank me every time I point at furniture." That almost made her smile. For the first 3 days, they moved around each other the way people move around an unfamiliar horse. They drank coffee at the same table, but did not know where to look. She asked if she could use a mug, if she could use the stove, if she could use the salt. He told her she lived here now, and every time he said it, the words "lived here" felt foreign in his mouth. At night, she would go to her room and shut the door very gently. He would go to his room and lie awake longer than usual, listening to the old house make its small sounds, pipes contracting, wind through the eaves. Once he heard her step into the hallway, pause near the kitchen, and then turn back. He did not ask. By Wednesday, all of Salida knew. That was how small towns worked. Someone bought nails at the hardware store at 8 in the morning, and by noon their aunt knew the brand. At Jenkins' Mercantile on F Street, Clara Jenkins stood behind the counter. She glanced at the plain silver ring on Abigail's finger, the ring Levi had bought Tuesday afternoon at Silver Vein Jewelers on Sackett Avenue, the cheapest in the case. Then she looked at Levi. Clara wasn't rude, she just raised one eyebrow.
That was fast.
"Well," she said, "that was quick." Abigail flushed. Levi set a salt block on the counter. "Need 2 more of these." Clara looked at him as though that was not the answer she had been waiting for, but she rang them up. "Congratulations, I suppose." "Thank you, ma'am," Abigail said softly. Out in the parking lot, Abigail stood by the passenger door with her arms folded. "Everybody thinks I'm ridiculous." "No," Levi said, throwing the last block into the bed of the truck. "Everybody is curious. That's different." "It feels the same." "It isn't." She looked across the lot to 2 men who had stopped talking when they walked out. "Do you regret it yet?" He pulled the tarp over the bed. "It's been 2 days." "That's not an answer." "I don't regret it yet." She nodded, but didn't entirely believe him.
Garrett came to Stone River early Thursday morning, before the frost had even burned off. Levi saw the vehicle before he saw the man. A black Range Rover, clean as though it had never carried anything heavier than a bottle of red wine. Garrett stood near the main barn in a charcoal wool coat and Italian leather boots, talking to Duke Palmer and another hand named Wesley Holt, as though he had already taken ownership of their ears. Abigail stiffened beside Levi. "Just walk," he said quietly. She did, but he saw her fingers tighten around her clipboard. Garrett turned as they approached. He had the kind of smile a man uses when he wants everyone to know he isn't worried. "Well," he said, "here they are, the happy couple." Abigail lifted her chin. "What are you doing here?" "Still Dad's property. My responsibility now." Garrett gave a single laugh. "You married a neighbor overnight, and now you think you're qualified to run a cattle operation?" The two hands looked down. That bothered Levi more than Garrett's words did. They were good men, but they were waiting to see who held the authority. Abigail opened her mouth and stopped. Garrett saw it and stepped closer. "You're making this harder than it has to be. Take the money. Go build a life somewhere that doesn't smell like wet hay." Levi moved half a step forward before he thought about it. Abigail noticed. So did Garrett. He smiled at Levi. "Nice play, Brooks. Marry the kid's sister and suddenly you're standing on stone land like you belong here." Levi's hand curled once, then relaxed. He had learned long ago that anger did not fix a fence, pay a bill, or win an argument in front of witnesses. "I'm standing next to my wife," he said. "That's all." Abigail glanced at him when he said it. Wife. The word fell between them heavier than it had at the courthouse. Garrett rolled his eyes. "Sure." He turned to the hands. "Nobody makes any major changes until this mess is sorted." Abigail found her voice. "That's not your decision." "Isn't it?" "No," she said, a little shaky.
"No,
"It isn't."
it's not."
Garrett looked amused, but Levi noticed Duke Palmer looking at her differently. Not convinced yet, but listening. After Garrett drove off, Abigail walked into the barn and gripped the edge of a stall. "I answered him."
I answered.
"Barely.
Just enough.
Barely still counts the first time." She exhaled and looked at him. "You could have shut him down."
You could have shut him down. Why
"I
did
could
you
have."
not?
"Why didn't you?"
Why
"Because
not?
then they'd all learn to look at me instead of you."
Instead of you.
She didn't like that answer at first. He saw it on her face. But she didn't argue. That afternoon, Levi walked her through the feed accounts. She sat beside him in the small office behind the milking shed, chewing the end of a pen while he explained which suppliers had given Matthew more time when cash got tight, and which ones had smiled while quietly tacking on late fees. "Every supplier in Chaffee County has two kinds of customers," he said. "The ones they chase and the ones who chase them. You pick which kind you want to be, and everything else follows." "I'm not in control." "Nobody's entirely in control. You just need to be the kind of customer the other side believes is in partial control. That way they don't call collections first when something goes sideways." She wrote that down. He laughed. "What? I didn't mean verbatim. I don't waste good advice." For the first time all week, the air between them loosened. The real test came 2 days later, with a broken stretch of fence along the west pasture. 3 posts had leaned after the rain. 1 strand of wire was slack enough to make trouble. Levi brought Abigail along because she needed to see how small problems became expensive when people ignored them. Duke Palmer was already there with tools. When Abigail told Duke to replace the corner brace, Duke looked straight past her at Levi. "Want it done today?" Duke asked him. Levi did not answer. He was sitting on a fallen log, a torn horse bridle held in his hands. He was retying a leather knot in the Western style of his grandfather's, an old style so old not many in Salida still knew it. He didn't lift his head. "Duke," he said quietly, his eyes on the bridle, "my wife is speaking to you." Duke shifted his weight. He looked back at Abigail. "Be more expensive to replace the post," Duke said. Abigail drew a breath.
I know. Do it right.
Do it right.
A long second. Then Duke nodded. Yes, ma'am. Abigail's face flushed with embarrassment, but she held still until Duke walked away. Then she turned on him. You weren't going to answer for me.
You were not going to
No.
answer for me.
But you said, my wife. That's true. I just reminded him it's true. The rest you did. Then the
Terrible.
corner of her mouth lifted. That was awful. It was. That night she made supper without asking where anything was. Egg scramble with green onion, 2 thin steaks from the freezer, seared, leftover roasted potatoes from earlier. Nothing fancy. But she set a plate in front of him as though she had done it 100 times. You didn't eat lunch. I was busy.
You did
You
not
always
eat
say
lunch.
that.
I was
Usually
You
true.
always say that.
After supper, she took the cardboard box of papers down and began to sort. She found it tucked between copies of the 2019 and 2020 property tax filings, an envelope marked, "For Abigail, if that day comes." She froze. Do you want to leave the room? Your call. She sat at the table and opened the envelope with shaking fingers. Inside were 3 pages of handwritten letter in Matthew Stone's hand, the same hand Levi had seen on hundreds of invoices, on tractor warranty paperwork, on small notes tacked to the barn door. She read silently. By the second page, she pressed her face into her hands. Finally, she pushed the letter across to him. He wrote about you. Levi picked it up. Abigail, my girl. If you are reading this, then I am no longer here to say it in person. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for many things. First, I'm sorry for the strange clause in the will. I know it'll anger you, and you'll probably hate me for a while. I can take it. You have to understand, Garrett. I understand him better than you do. Your brother has believed since he was 16 that I loved you more. Maybe I did. Not because I loved Garrett any less, but because you were easier to love. A father shouldn't say that, but I owe you my honesty now. I was not fair. You and Garrett are now living with the consequences of that unfairness. If Garrett is given the chance, he will sell Stone River within 6 months. I know this the way I know the direction of the wind. I don't blame him. He's wanted to leave since he was 16. But this is not his decision to make. Levi Brooks is the one I trust. I have watched the way he kept Brooks Meadow standing after his folks were killed, when no one told him he had to keep it. I have watched him stay when other young people left. I'm not telling you to love him. I'm telling you to stand near him for a while and see what you learn. Your mother wouldn't have approved of how I'm doing this. She would have said I was meddling. Maybe she's right, but she's not here anymore, and I'm going to be gone too, and I have no other way to protect you from where I'm headed. Keep Stone River if you want it. Sell it if you want. I don't need you to live the life I lived. I just need you not to be forced. Love, Dad. Levi set the letter down. His eyes were hot, and he didn't want her to see, so he looked out the window. Abigail wiped her eyes. He knew he was going sooner than he told me. Probably. He thought about you. Looks like it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, almost whispering, I didn't know I was allowed to keep this ranch. I thought I was just fighting not to lose to Garrett. I didn't think about what winning would mean. You're thinking now. I'm thinking now. Garrett did not come back for almost a week. Levi knew that meant he was calculating. That worried him more than the yelling had. One windy Saturday afternoon, Abigail ran across the yard at Brooks Meadow, phone in one hand, hat in the other. He's at my place, she said. Garrett with 2 strangers. Duke called me. They're walking the south pasture. Levi shut off the water valve. Buyers. My guess. He grabbed the keys.
She was in the truck before he was. The whole way over, she stared through the windshield, breathing like she was trying to keep herself from saying too much. In the Stone River yard, Garrett stood near the cattle pens with two men in clean jackets. One wore polished Oxford shoes. Oxford shoes in a yard still wet from the night's rain. That was the first thing Levi noticed. "Abigail," Garrett called when he saw them. "Good, saves me the phone call." She got out of the truck and slammed the door harder than she had meant to. "What are you doing?" "Showing the property to interested parties. It's not for sale." One of the men shifted uncomfortably. The other looked at Garrett as if waiting for him to handle it. Garrett walked slowly toward them. "It will be, once the courthouse circus is over." Abigail's fingers tightened on her coat. Levi stood beside her, but he did not step ahead of her. Everyone looked at him anyway. Levi kept his voice low. "Your land. Say it." Her eyes held his, wide and afraid. Then she turned back. "This ranch is not for sale," she said. Garrett laughed as though she had told a joke. "Did you hear that, gentleman? Married 5 minutes and already thinks she's the owner." "I am the owner," Abigail said. Her voice trembled, but she kept going. "And you don't get to bring strangers through my pastures without asking." Garrett's smile thinned. "Your confidence is fake. Your marriage is fake. And when Levi here gets tired of playing hero, you'll be standing here alone with bills you can't pay and men you can't manage." The line landed exactly where he had aimed it. Levi saw Abigail take the hit. Her shoulders dropped a little. One of the buyers cleared his throat. "Garrett, maybe we should—" Garrett shot him a look, then turned back to Abigail. "You'll regret this." Maybe, she said. "But it'll be my regret." Garrett left, with tires throwing mud near the cattle guard. The buyers followed, slower, less certain. Abigail didn't chase. She didn't cry. She just stood until both vehicles disappeared. Then she walked straight into the barn. He found her in the tack room, one hand against the wall. "I thought I was going to be sick." "But you weren't." "That's your comfort?" "That's the truth." She gave a weak laugh and covered her face. "He's right about some of it." "He isn't." "I don't know how to run all of this, Levi." Nobody ever said running cattle is easy. They just said it's one thing, not 20. Today you run today's thing. Tomorrow you run tomorrow's thing. People call that running the ranch. They could also call it the only way of not getting swallowed by it. She looked at him for a long moment, and something softened in her face. That night, Abigail sat out on the back porch at Brooks Meadow for a long time. Levi found her near 10 o'clock, his mother's quilt around her shoulders, a cold cup of tea in her hand. She didn't turn when he sat down beside her. "I called my friend in Boulder. I was going to tell her I'd sell and come stay with her." "Did you?" "I hung up before she picked up." He said nothing. "You know why." "Why?" "Because I saw the light in your barn was still on. I knew you were still out there. I thought, if I leave, who's going to explain to him why I left?" He looked out at the pasture. Snow on the distant peaks caught the moonlight. Somewhere, an owl called. "Then don't leave." The gate on the Silver Creek Road pasture was opened on a windy Wednesday afternoon. It might have been an accident. It might not. Levi didn't say what he suspected, because suspicion didn't pull cattle off the road. Duke called first. They were loading feed buckets at Brooks Meadow when her phone rang.
It's bad. I don't know
She
what to
picked
do.
up, listened, went pale. "Cattle are out on Silver Creek Road."
Cattle are
He
out
was
on
already
the
moving
road.
before she finished. By the time they got there, 6 head had pushed through the opening and scattered along the ditch. One was too close to the road. A UPS truck had stopped with its hazards flashing. Rain had begun again, cold and mean. Abigail jumped out before he could tell her what to do. "Stay wide," he called. "Don't run straight at them." "I know," she snapped back, sharp. She climbed over the fence to cut off a steer that had gone too far, and a strand of barbed wire raked her right pant leg open. A long cut. Blood bled through her jeans. She did not stop. The next 2 hours, they worked with Duke and 2 neighbors to push the cattle back through the gate. Abigail was everywhere, muddy, soaked, hair stuck to her neck, shouting when she had to, and listening when she had to. Once a cow shouldered her hard while she was driving it through a corner. Not a real hit, just the push of 200 kilos of beef, and she sat down hard in the mud. She got up immediately. No cry, no tears, just a change of approach. When the last animal was inside and the temporary chain was set, Abigail bent over with both hands on her knees.
Are you okay?
"You okay?" "No," she said, breathing hard. "But they're in." Duke came over, rainwater dripping off his hat. "You did good, Abigail." She straightened as if those 4 words weighed more than every speech Garrett had ever made. On the ride back, she was quiet. Mud covered her jeans, her hands were scratched. She looked exhausted, but not defeated. Back at Brooks Meadow, he set out clean towels by the bathroom and made coffee, even though it was too late for coffee. She came into the kitchen wearing one of his flannel shirts because her own clothes were ruined, sleeves falling over her hands. "I look ridiculous." "You look like you worked."
I look like I worked.
She sat down. "Do you still see me the way you did that first night?" He looked at her. "No," he said. Her eyes held his. The old house was quiet around them. There was no rain pounding now, only dripping from the eaves. She stood first. He did too. Neither said anything clever or careful. When she stepped closer, he did not step back. What happened between them that night was not part of the arrangement. It was not a story they were performing for Garrett, for the town, for William Hartley reading papers. It was quiet, honest, and theirs. In the morning, she was still there beside him, her hand on his chest as if it belonged there. For the first time since he had signed the paper, Levi was afraid. He was afraid of what would happen once the ranch was safe, because he knew by then that the ranch was not the only thing he wanted to keep. Garrett came on Friday morning. No buyers, no smile. He was waiting at the bottom of the porch at Brooks Meadow when Levi stepped out to drive to William Hartley's office. Abigail was still inside, putting on her coat. Garrett didn't look at Levi as he passed. He just said, "I want to talk to my sister." Levi paused. "She can decide whether she wants to talk to you." Abigail stepped onto the porch, 3 clipboards under her arm. She saw Garrett. She stood still for a moment. 5 minutes. He pulled a thick envelope from inside his coat. "You don't need that meeting, Abigail. I'm willing to call this all off. $600,000. Cash. You divorce this guy today. You go wherever you want. The land sells to whoever buys it. You win, I win. Everyone goes home." She looked at the envelope. Levi didn't speak. This was a decision she had to make alone. He had understood that before last night, and now he understood it more. Abigail took the envelope. She held it still on her lap in Levi's pickup all the way to William Hartley's office. She did not open it. She did not speak. Levi did not ask. He just drove. About halfway there, she said, "600,000 is a lot." "Yes." "Do you think I should take it?"
Do you think
"I can't answer that." "Why?" "Because if I say yes, you'll think I've given up on you. If I say no, you'll think I'm holding you for my own sake. Neither one is true. You have to answer it." She didn't speak again until they reached town. On Sackett Avenue, 2 blocks from William's office, Abigail told him to pull over. She got out, walked to the public trash bin on the corner, and tore the envelope in half, then in quarters, then in eighths. She dropped it in. She did not say anything when she climbed back in. Levi did not ask. He just kept driving. William Hartley's office sat above First Colorado Bank in the old downtown of Salida, up a narrow stairway with worn carpet that smelled of dust. William had known Matthew Stone for decades. That made him harder for Garrett to push around than most. Garrett was already seated when they came in, one ankle resting on the opposite knee as if he owned the chair, the office, and every acre under discussion. He glanced at Abigail's stack of papers and then at Levi. "Brought your hired hand?" Abigail sat down before Levi could answer. "I brought my husband." Garrett smiled. "That word is doing a lot of work lately." William cleared his throat. He was an older man with wire-rim glasses and a careful way of handling paper. "We are here to review compliance with the clause in Mr. Stone's estate documents," he said, "and to address Mr. Stone's concerns regarding operational control." Garrett leaned forward. "Good. Then let's address the obvious. This marriage is a stunt. She panicked, grabbed the most bankrupt neighbor she could find, and now we're all pretending this is normal." Abigail's hand tightened on the stack. Levi wanted to reach across the table, but he did not. Garrett continued. "She's 24, no serious management experience, does not understand the financial burden, the maintenance, the liability, or the long-term value of the property. Selling is the responsible choice." William looked at Abigail. "Would you like to respond?" The room was still. A month earlier, she might have looked at Levi first. She did not this time. She opened the stack. "Yes, I would." She laid out the paid invoices first: feed, vet, fuel, 2 equipment repairs, 3 fencing orders. Then the supplier agreements she had renegotiated herself. Workers' schedules with names, hours, duties. The repair plan for the south barn roof. A note signed by Duke Palmer and 2 other hands confirming they accepted her as the person directing daily decisions. Garrett laughed under his breath. "You got the help to sign a paper. Congratulations." Abigail did not look at him. "I also brought statements from Clara Jenkins at Jenkins Mercantile, Mr. Tilden at Tilden's Garage, and 2 neighboring ranches confirming ongoing operations and support." Levi saw William's eyebrows lift slightly. Abigail's voice stayed steady. "I am not claiming I know everything. I am saying the ranch is operating. Bills are being handled. Repairs are scheduled. The cattle are accounted for. The hands know who makes decisions, and the property is not for sale." Garrett's face shifted a little. The confidence held, but it tightened at the edges. "You rehearsed that well?" Abigail finally turned toward him. "Garrett, when I'm speaking, you wait until I'm finished. I am not going to say this again." It was not loud. That was what made it good. Garrett blinked once. Levi looked at the table because he almost smiled.
and it was not the time. William reviewed the papers slowly. Garrett grew more irritated with each page. He shifted in his chair, checked his watch, then stopped pretending to be patient. "This is insane," he said. "Dad never meant to trap the land in some fantasy. He knew she needed guidance. That was the reason for the clause." "No," Abigail said. "He knew you would sell as soon as you could." Garrett pointed at Levi. "And him. You think he's here out of kindness. Levi Brooks has been one bad season away from losing his own place for years. You expect me to believe he married you out of loyalty?" He felt Abigail look at him. So did William. Levi leaned forward. "I don't need Abigail's ranch. I have one I can barely keep standing." Garrett smirked. "That's my point." "No, your point is that everything has a price. Mine doesn't." The room was still. He looked at William, then at Abigail. "I married her because Matthew Stone was right about one thing. She needed somebody to stand beside her while she learned how to stand here without being pushed over." Abigail's eyes softened, but he kept going because Garrett needed to hear the rest. "But she is standing now. You can dress it up however you want. Responsible choice, land value, future planning. You don't want the ranch because it is a burden to you. She wants it because it was home before it was worth money." Garrett's jaw worked, but the words didn't come out right. William stacked the papers neatly and removed his glasses. "The marriage certificate satisfies the stated condition," he said. "And based on the records provided, Mrs. Brooks has demonstrated active operational control. The estate will proceed with Abigail Brooks retaining control of Stone River Ranch." Brooks. That was the first time Levi had heard her called by his last name, outside the paper at the courthouse. Something stopped in his chest. For a second, no one moved. Abigail closed her eyes, just once. Then she opened them and nodded the way one nods when accepting a job, not a prize. Garrett stood so fast the chair scraped the floor. "You'll regret this, both of you."
But it will be my regret.
Abigail looked up at him.
Feel the Wren's shoulders sit.
"Maybe, but it'll be my regret." He stared at her, waiting for her to shrink. She didn't. He grabbed his coat and walked out. Through the window, Levi watched him cut across the parking lot, the Italian boots stepping around puddles as though the ground itself had insulted him. He got in the Range Rover and drove off without looking back. They went down the stairs and out to the truck. The town moved around them as though nothing had happened. A delivery man carried boxes into a pharmacy. A woman crossed the street with a paper bag of groceries. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. Abigail stood by the passenger door and looked at the ring on her hand. "The ranch is safe." "Looks that way." She nodded, still looking down. "Then you don't have to do this anymore." He knew what she meant. He waited. She lifted her eyes. "You helped me more than I had any right to ask, but the promise was made under pressure. If you want out, I won't hold you to it."
Over.
For a moment, all he could hear was traffic on the wet street and the low hum of the bank sign above them. A month earlier, he would have known what to say. He would have said they had made a deal, and the deal was done. He would have gone home to his quiet kitchen, his cold dinners, his fences, his bills, his life exactly as it had been. But he thought about Abigail at his table, with sticky notes pasted on every bill. Abigail in his old flannel after the cattle got loose. Abigail telling Garrett to wait until she had finished speaking. Abigail tearing up a $600,000 envelope without saying a word. Abigail learning the weight of the land and choosing to carry it anyway. "I drove to the courthouse last Tuesday with one thought,"
he said slowly. I was signing my name to help you with something. I walked out of William's office today with a completely different thought. You don't need me to sign anything anymore, but I don't want to take my name off. She didn't breathe. So I am not the man helping you anymore, he said. I am just the man who is here. Her eyes filled, but she smiled at the same time. Then she reached for his hand. I think about the difference between I am helping you and I am here. Two sentences that sound similar, both expressions of presence, but I think they differ at the foundation. I am helping you is a service. It has a beginning, an end, and some measure of success. The helper can always retreat once the task is complete. I am here has no ending. It is not a service. It is a fact. The person who is here cannot retreat because there is nothing to retreat from. They have become part of the landscape, like trees and fences and unfinished cups of coffee.
Levi moved from the first position to the second over a span of about 2 weeks. He didn't announce it, he didn't declare it. He simply stood there long enough that the conversion happened. And when the safety of the ranch finally permitted him to leave, he discovered he no longer knew how to leave. That, I would say, is how real love quietly displaces transactional love. Not with a grand declaration, with the disappearance at some unremembered moment of the option of walking away. They drove home without saying much. They didn't need to. When they reached the fence line between Brooks Meadow and Stone River, the late sun had broken through, laying gold over the wet pasture. In the distance, Mount Princeton stood white under a clearing sky. The two ranches sat side by side, worn, imperfect, still standing. Abigail stepped up beside him, not behind him. Her hand stayed in his. Some stories end with a wedding. This one didn't, because the wedding was at the beginning, and what came after the wedding was not a bigger story. It was simply a longer life. There would be cattle to tend. There would be fences that broke again. There would be bills that arrived. There would be hard nights that no pretty words could solve. That is the way of the land, and that is the way of two people who have chosen to stand on it together. I want to leave one final thought, not about Levi and Abigail, but about Matthew Stone's will. People will read this story and conclude that Matthew was a wise father, that he had orchestrated the marriage to protect his daughter. But I don't think Matthew was wise. I think he was desperate. He had watched Garrett become the man he had known Garrett would become, and he had not been able to fix it in time. He had raised Abigail the way parents raise the favored child, much love, but no training for battle. By the end of his life, he realized he had left her unprepared for the world he was about to leave behind. The will was not the gift of a wise father. It was the apology of a father who had done it wrong and was trying to make it right with the time he had left. Levi was not the man he chose for his daughter in the traditional sense. Levi was the buoy he threw into the sea, hoping his daughter knew how to swim to it. And the unexpected thing, the thing Matthew may have hoped for but did not dare believe, was that Abigail did not need to be pulled up. She had swum to that buoy under her own power. And that, I think, is the most beautiful part of this story. It is not the story of a man rescuing a woman. It is the story of a woman learning to rescue herself, with a man wise enough to stand beside her without getting in her way. For the first time in years, when Levi looked across the land, he did not see himself alone. And that is all that needs to be said.